Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
Doing to promote Scotland's reputation overseas as that of a welcoming.
Wherever you stand, get
international human rights standards in all our international engagement. Scotland is the new collective approach for the Scottish Government and partner agencies to market Scotland to the world as a progressive and welcoming nation. Scotland is now reaches out internationally to encourage people to be part of Scotland's future, to live, to work, study, visit and do business here.
Gillian Martin.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. I can't have been alone in having conversations with constituents concerned at images of far-right factions appearing at EU exit demonstrations in London, seemingly emboldened by political events and led by characters taking advantage of the situation to spread messages that one can only hope never become associated with the vast majority of us in the eyes of those watching from overseas. Can the Cabinet Secretary give an idea of what steps the Scottish Government has gone to engage with EU nationals and new Scots living in Scotland to reassure them that they are valued, respected and that racism and xenophobia have no place in their society? And what engagement has it had with the UK Government Home Office in putting forward the view that Scotland should continue to be a destination of choice for those who want to contribute to our society?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member raises hugely important issues of our time. The only way to tackle racism and xenophobia is to tackle it head on, and that requires political leadership, and that requires, I think, everyone to step up to the mark. Sadly, that in certain parts of the United Kingdom that's been sadly lacking, and in terms of our engagement with EU nationals, we've been engaging with EU citizens for some time in terms of giving reassurance to them. Only this week we announced our service to help support in relation to settled status, and yesterday the Parliament agreed that the settled status fees should be abolished because the cultural and the economic value of our EU citizens should not be put on the price of a settled fee status. But, Presiding Officer, I cannot have been the only person to have looked at the white paper produced by the UK Home Office, and our Migration Minister spoke to Caroline Noakes, the Minister there, only yesterday. This is no way for Scotland to have a future governed by a government that produces such a white paper. Their proposal to have 85% potential reduction on EEA citizens living in Scotland would be absolutely catastrophic for our economies and the diversity and the distribution of the communities in our remote rural areas, let alone our tourism, our hospitality and other sectors. But, Presiding Officer, even worse than the economic effect is what does this say about the country that the UK has become? Scotland cannot be part of a system that perpetuates that kind of attitude to those that want to come here. Scotland wants to welcome people because we value them, and that's the message that this government will continue to put out.
Question number 2, Linda Fabiani.
To ask the Scottish Government how it has evaluated the pilot in schools of its Equally Safe programme.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, we are pleased to be working with Rape Crisis Scotland and Zero Tolerance to take forward Equally Safe at School, which aims to promote a whole-school approach to tackling gender-based violence. Last year it was delivered in 2 secondary schools, including St John Ogilvie and Calder Glen, which is in the member's constituency, and it has been delivered in a further 2 schools this year. The project is in the 2nd year of a 3-year pilot, and the University of Glasgow are currently undertaking a formative evaluation of it. Further work is ongoing with a view to a full-scale evaluation to progress commencing next year.
Linda Fabiani.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary is very aware of the work that has been carried out by various young women's organisations, including Young Women Lead, about sexual harassment in schools. A concern I have is that we don't have what I believe is called intersectionality amongst public agencies when dealing with such things. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that there is discussion going on amongst agencies, schools, government, local government, the police, health service, for example, to make sure that we really can be equally safe in schools?
Cabinet Secretary.
I would want to give Linda Fabiani that reassurance. It is important that in all areas of government we take seriously the issues that are raised by the Young Women Lead Committee's report and other reports on the question of sexual harassment in schools. I had the opportunity to provide evidence to the Human Rights Committee in Parliament, the Equalities and Human Rights Committee in Parliament just last week in relation to the evidence and the report of the Young Women Lead Committee, indeed to follow representatives of that committee. It is a powerful and deeply uncomfortable testimony that those young women have produced in this report and in their evidence to Parliament. And I'm committed to making sure that in all aspects of the Government's work, whether it's in my core policy responsibilities in relation to education, where we've seen significant progress with the gender-based violence work being rolled out in relation to the Emily Drury campaign, which Fiona Drury has taken forward and which has been embraced by our universities and colleges, to make sure that's replicated in schools, particularly through the work that we take forward on relationships, sexual health and parenthood education, and of course to making sure more widely in government that all areas of government are taking this message seriously.
Question number 3, Claire Baker.
Apologies, President Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking in response to the antisocial or illegal use of quad bikes or similar vehicles.
Minister Ashton.
I'm well aware of the risk to public safety caused by careless, inconsiderate and antisocial driving, which is why I fully support Police Scotland and its partners to deal with the misuse of vehicles in an appropriate and a proportionate way. I believe that local policing teams are ideally placed to engage with members of the community to identify where the misuse of vehicles is causing distress to the public. This ensures that these areas can be prioritised for proactive action to prevent future instances and identify and deal with those engaged in the misuse of vehicles.
Claire Baker.
The Minister may be aware that Fife, particularly the Leavenmouth area, continues to experience antisocial behaviour despite the best efforts of local police, and this is continuing to put at risk a serious or even fatal accident. The local police inspector has called for more powers to tackle this menace, a call which I back. Will the Minister agree to meet with me in the new year to discuss how we can support our local police and ensure they have the appropriate powers to take the necessary action?
Minister.
I thank the member for raising that issue. I am aware of this. I would certainly be happy to meet with the member to discuss it. The Antisocial Behaviour Scotland Act of 2004 does provide a wide range of measures for dealing with all forms of antisocial behaviour, and our national strategy is based on prevention, early intervention and diversionary activities. The Scottish Government is currently working with a group of local authorities to use their expertise and knowledge to inform, refresh and update all of our guidance documents on tackling antisocial behaviour.
Thank you. Question number 4, Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what progress it is making in reducing youth unemployment in North Ayrshire.
Minister Jamie Hepburn.
Youth unemployment for 16 to 24-year-olds in North Ayrshire in the October 2016 to September 2017 period was down 13.8% from its peak in the post-economic downturn period in the October 2011 to September 2012 period.
Kenneth Gibson.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Scottish Enterprise has recently announced funding of £10 million to invest in infrastructure at Hunterston in my constituency. Can the Minister advise the Chamber as to how many jobs this will help to create and how many apprenticeships it will secure for young people in North Ayrshire?
Jamie Hepburn.
Well, of course, I'm aware of the investment. It's been provided to support the transformation of Scotland's energy sector, as well as providing significant opportunities for the North Ayrshire economy. Skills Development Scotland has been working closely with Scottish Enterprise and Peel Ports. We'll be undertaking work to explore the potential odd job opportunities and the skills demands that will be required. Understand there will be around 40 apprenticeship opportunities, and of course through Skills Development Scotland we will be very delighted to support those opportunities for North Ayrshire's young people.
Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A recent report published this month by the Health Foundation looked at some of the challenges facing young people right across the UK. One of the locations they chose was North Ayrshire. And looking through the feedback from young people responded, some of the comments were that they had a perception that opportunities were scarce and that they may have to move elsewhere. So notwithstanding the very good work that is going on, what does the Minister think we could all do to help promote some of these excellent opportunities?
Minister.
Let me say, when I go round the country, and Ayrshire, North Ayrshire will be no different, one of the big challenges we do have is that there are a range of opportunities on young people's doorsteps. They're just not always aware of those opportunities, and that's a critical element of our developing the young workforce strategy, and it's to make young people aware of those opportunities. And I would urge every member, including Mr Green, to make sure that young people are aware of the Developing Young Workforce Initiative.
Ruth Maguire.
Thank you. With hundreds of jobs and £350 million worth of investment at stake, does the Minister agree that it's time for the UK Government to stop dragging its heels on the Ayrshire growth deal and join the Scottish Government and local authorities signing heads of terms on the 25th of January to bring these much-needed jobs and investment to Ayrshire?
Minister.
We are committed to supporting the Ayrshire economy through a growth deal. The Ayrshire local authorities have indicated that they want to sign heads of terms for a deal on the 25th of January. The Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Innovation and Connectivity has responded to say he is willing to do so. He has written to the Secretary of State for Scotland to urge the UK Government to agree to this timescale. Thus far, we await a reply.
And question number 5, Monica Lennon.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to improve support for women who have lipoedema.
Minister Joe Fitzpatrick.
The Scottish Government recognises that lipoedema can be a distressing and painful condition. As with all long-term conditions, we want people living with lipoedema to be able to access the best possible care and support. Lipoedema services are mainly provided by therapists, including nurses and allied health professionals who are based in lymphoedema services available in every health board in Scotland. Over the last 3 years, we've worked to improve lymphoedema services via the National Lymphoedema Care in Scotland Working Group.
Monica Lennon.
I thank the Minister for his reply. Anne Henry, who I've been working with for over a year now, went public about how difficult it is to get a diagnosis for lipoedema on the NHS. Following a private diagnosis, Anne has faced a battle to get NHS treatment. There is only one surgeon in the NHS in Scotland who can perform the surgery she needs. Anne was due to have surgery in Nine Wells Hospital next month, but she's been told to expect a delay because of staff capacity issues. Last month, the Minister made a call. He told me there is no demand for a second surgeon. But Spice advised that over 250,000 women in Scotland have lipoedema. Can the Minister explain why one surgeon is sufficient? Will he look at the capacity issues again? And will he meet with me in the new year to discuss ways to improve lipoedema healthcare?
Minister.
Obviously, I was pleased to hear that the member's constituent has got an appointment going forward. I hope that takes place in a timeous manner. Liposuction is not necessarily the best and appropriate treatment for everyone with lipoedema. So while there are the numbers that the member suggested in terms of people with lipoedema, that doesn't mean to say that number of people that is the best treatment. And clearly that's a discussion between the clinician and the patient to decide what the best treatment is for. Dr. Alex Munach is the leading surgeon who performs this specialist treatment, performs it in Dundee, and I think there is a real danger that if we had more surgeons performing that particular surgery, then they wouldn't be able to maintain their skill sets in terms of the terms, the demand for that service. And that would be something that I think that would really send alarm bells ringing for me if we were potentially having a number of surgeons who weren't managing to keep their skill set up to date. But of course I'm happy to meet with the member to discuss these matters in the new year.
Question number 6, John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what proportion of freight is conveyed by rail.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
Network Rail advised that there are currently around 45 freight trains a day in Scotland. The latest figures available show that the proportion of freight conveyed by rail relate to 2012-13, when the percentage was 4.3%. We do not have a more up-to-date figure because, although Transport Scotland continues to request information, one large freight operator, for commercial reasons, will not release its volume data. We are seeking to have this matter resolved.
John Finney.
I thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that reply. The Cabinet Secretary will be of frustrations that are connected with any trying to improvements with conveying freight by rail, and I include the Highland Spring. And the Cabinet Secretary will be aware that we support the devolution of Network Rail. The reopening of the Leavenmouth link and the dualling of the Highland Main Line would dramatically increase the potential for freight to be moved from road to rail. Will the Cabinet Secretary progress those projects in the 2019-2024 control period?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the member made reference to a number of projects, in particular the one in Highland Spring. He'll be aware that work has actually started on providing a link at Highland Spring to allow them to move from road to rail, which will support their ambitions for freight investment. There also, the member will be interested in the work that's been undertaken on the Northern Line, which is about helping to provide greater access for freight along with greater resilience for passenger services. One of the areas of work that we will be giving a greater focus on in the next control period is further enhancements to the infrastructure of Scotland's rail network, including that providing greater provision for the ability to have a higher level of freight on our rails in Scotland.
Thank you. Question number 7, Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how many integration joint boards have projected an overspend for 2018-19.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
Before taking into account mitigating actions by partnerships, the latest position indicates 22 integration authorities projecting an overspend. Management in terms of mitigating actions includes planned additional funding from partners, delivery of financial recovery plans and appropriate use of reserves. Taking these into account, I expect integration authorities to deliver a balanced financial outturn, in part because, as a key comparison, last year at the end of December, integration authorities were forecasting a combined £71 million overspend. However, by the end of the financial year, they reported a £39 million underspend in their combined final accounts.
Alex Rowley.
Thank you for that answer. I think the Cabinet Secretary, if she looks at the detail of that, many of those IGBs that were projecting overspends did overspend, and the local authorities came along and used balances to be able to bail them out. The fact is that the IGBs right across Scotland are in crisis. The Accounts Commission report 2 weeks ago stated that the majority of IGBs have underlying financial sustainability issues, and the reality is, if I can talk about Fife, I believe Fife IGB was set up to fail because it was set up with a deficit. It started off its working life with a deficit. Will she agree to start to have discussions with NHS Fife and Fife Council and look at putting the Health and Social Care Partnership onto a proper financial stability moving forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr Rowley for that answer. Do you know, at the end of March, our combined integration joint boards were sitting with £124.25 million of reserves. These are part of the mitigating actions that I am discussing. Of course, this is a joint venture between local authorities and health boards, and whilst Mr Rowley may be correct that in terms of the last financial year, local authorities provided additional funds, so too did health boards, and much of that came from our overall health budget and the transfer to local government that is in both the settlement and in the health settlement itself. That is the case currently, yet again, for this year's draft budget. So we need to be really clear and careful here about how we talk about the funding of our integrated joint boards and how that money is managed. And part of the discussion that I have had very helpfully with my counterpart in COSLA, Councillor Curry, is to look in January at a number of matters around the funding and resourcing of integrated joint boards, not least those reserves, which are not new and have increased from the year before. Mr Rowley and I have already discussed the Fife IJB, of course. That deficit that they started with came from both the local authority and the health board, and we do need to assist in that particular instance, I believe, that particular IJB who started off in a poor footing and needs some joint assistance from us in order to help them move forward. And again, Councillor Curry and I have already had an initial discussion on that, and we will continue that in the early part of next year.
Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Edinburgh's integrated joint board is set to be £10.3 million over budget. They're looking to use £1.3 million of their reserve to reduce that deficit. It's clear this Parliament needs to have more financial accountability over the integrated joint boards. So can I ask, what in the new year will the Cabinet Secretary be bringing forward to make sure we can achieve that, like we have with health boards?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, if Mr Briggs is referring to the 3-year funding plan that I announced for health boards, then he will, of course, also be aware in terms of the IJBs that they have the capacity to hold reserves. Indeed, I've just been talking about the amount of money that they do have, and Edinburgh is sitting with just over £8 million at this point. But Mr Briggs will also know that I hope that he is now in receipt of this, replied in detail to the detailed pre-budget scrutiny from the Health and Sport Committee, much of which talks about the financing and the governance of the IJBs. And in January, I'll have the pleasure of being before that committee to give evidence and discuss those matters further, and I certainly look forward to doing that.
Thank you very much, and that concludes general questions. We're going to turn to First Minister's questions, and before we take the first question, I believe the First Minister would like to make a statement about the anniversary of the Lockerbie tragedy 30 years ago.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am grateful for the opportunity to reflect briefly on tomorrow's 30th anniversary of the Lockerbie bombing. Tomorrow, the Solicitor General is attending events in the United States, and the Lord Advocate will represent the Scottish Government at the memorial service in Lockerbie. I know that several local MSPs will also be attending commemorations. However, I'm sure that everyone in this chamber will reflect on the anniversary in some way. First and foremost, we will remember those who died on the 21st of December 1988, 270 people from a total of 21 nations. We will think about all those who lost loved ones, and we will also think about everyone affected by the tragedy. For example, our emergency services who worked so hard in such incredibly difficult and traumatic circumstances. And of course, we will think about the residents of Lockerbie itself. In doing so, we will reflect on how an almost unimaginable tragedy brought out incredible reserves of solidarity, compassion and love. The bereaved showed immense dignity and resilience. People in Lockerbie and the surrounding area opened their hearts to those who had lost loved ones. Enduring ties and friendships have been created. For example, Syracuse University, which lost 35 of its students in the bombing, now accepts 2 scholarship pupils every year from Lockerbie Academy. That is a powerful example of the way in which people have worked to remember the past in a way which also builds hope for the future. That hope is also now part of the legacy of Lockerbie, and that is perhaps something to hold in our hearts tomorrow as we look back on the tragedy, as we think about all those who lost loved ones, and as we remember and honour all those who died.
Thank you very much. We turn now to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Jackson Carlo.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I associate myself entirely with remarks the First Minister has made and the remarks that the Prime Minister made yesterday. As I was preparing for Christmas that year, so were the Somerville family. Jack Somerville had been the retail vehicle sales manager in our family business for some 20 years before he'd retired. I remember him with great affection. Yes, he had a sheepskin coat, like all the best used car sales managers. He was fond of a cigar. He was a big personality. He and his family were in the house in which the plane landed and were obliterated. And I know I and many of his former colleagues, along with all those who lost relatives and friends, think fondly of them each year when this anniversary comes around. Presiding Officer, punctuality in our train service reaching its worst point for 12 years. Hundreds of trains cancelled. and shortages of staff because people are being trained to use the new class of trains, which are also delayed, causing another 100 services to be cut last month. Doesn't the First Minister think train passengers across Scotland are owed an apology?
First Minister.
Yes, I do, and ScotRail has made very clear that they regret the cancellations and the delays that have been caused as a result. Let me be perfectly clear, the level of cancellations this week in particular has been unacceptable. Of course, these have been due to a combination of factors, not least train crew shortages, but also a number of other issues. Infrastructure issues like Monday's signals failure at Perth have accounted for a significant number, and these cannot simply be laid at the door of ScotRail. Tragically, we must also recognise that understandable knock-on disruption has followed the loss of life on the railways this week, and I'm sure the sympathies of everyone in the chamber go to the families and loved ones of those who have died. That said, I want to be very clear that we've seen a significant and unacceptable number of delays that are clearly the responsibility of ScotRail. I can report to Parliament that cancellations of this type have fallen as the week has progressed, from around 144 on Monday to an estimated 40 today. Progress is being made, but it is not good enough. We expect, indeed we demand, better from the rail operator, and the Transport Secretary continues to work closely with them to ensure that we continue to see improvements in the days to come.
Jackson Carlo.
Well, it's interesting because, in fact, we've got new official figures that show that since 2011, there have, in fact, been more than 35,000 cancellations or part cancellations caused entirely by ScotRail. That amounts to some 5,000 a year. And people want to know why this SNP government is failing to deliver. Let's just examine their record. 2 years ago, the last time we had problems on the tracks, the then Transport Minister, Humza Yousaf, played the big man and hauled in ScotRail, threatening, and I quote, serious consequences. They were left in no uncertain terms that I expect improvement, he fumed. And yet what's happened since? Punctuality has fallen, and instead of serious consequences, Mr Yousaf has done a ministerial bunk to the Justice Department, where he's now clearing up the mess left by Mr Matheson, while Mr Matheson has swapped seats to clear up the mess left by Mr Yousaf. Talking tough, cabinet musical chairs, failing to deliver improvements, then giving in. Isn't that the record of this government on our rail network?
First Minister.
I'm not sure the Tories are on particularly safe ground here, but we will leave that to one side for the moment. Of course, when Humza Yousaf, then the Transport Minister, took that action with ScotRail, we did see improvements. While I'm not standing here and saying that the performance of ScotRail is good enough, because it is not, in terms of punctuality in particular, the performance of ScotRail is usually better than the performance of other large train operators elsewhere in the UK. Our responsibility, though, is to continue to work with ScotRail to deliver improvements. In the last few weeks, there have been issues with shortages of train crews. As ScotRail has set out, these are largely down to two issues as they've introduced the new timetable. The introduction of that has been impacted by, yes, the late delivery of the Hitachi trains. There aren't the number quite of the Hitachi trains yet in service as were expected. There also, of course, was the industrial action, which I'm glad to say is now resolved. ScotRail are working hard to resolve these issues, as I've said, not saying that this is good enough, and I absolutely recognise the frustration of the travelling public, but we have, over the course of this week, seen the number of cancellations reduced, and I expect to see that number continue to reduce, and expect to see continued improvement over the next few days, particularly as we go into the holiday period and then into the New Year period. The Transport Secretary discusses these issues regularly with ScotRail. He spoke to both the managing directors of ScotRail and Abellio earlier this week and made clear the urgent need for improvement.
Jackson Carlo.
Right. Well, let's recall something else from 2 years ago. Then the Transport Minister came forward and handed out £3 million worth of discounted fares following the disruption. This, he said, was to thank passengers for their patience. 2 years on, it's not passengers who are getting a break, it's the train operator, because the current Transport Minister decided to waive sanctions that they were facing for missing targets. Why? Because they would have breached the franchise agreement had the targets been kept in place. So support for passengers 1 year, a bailout for train operators the next. Who is getting the better deal here, First Minister? Scotland's hard-pressed commuters or the owners of the rail franchise?
First Minister.
Tough sanctions in place for failure to deliver, and it's right and proper that that is the case. Of course, passengers make a contribution towards the cost of running the railway through rail fares, and again, I absolutely understand the frustration of passengers when they're paying through rail fares and not getting the performance they deserve. However, in Scotland, I think it's important to stress that it's the Scottish Government that meets the majority of the cost of rail passenger services in Scotland. We've taken action to minimise the impact on passengers by capping increases for regulated ScotRail peak fares at the level of RPI. Regulated off-peak fare increases are capped at 1% lower than inflation, and that means that in Scotland average rail fares increases are actually lower than they are in England and Wales. So we will continue to do what we can to keep the level of rail fares as reasonable as possible, and we will continue the work to invest in our railways to improve the number and the quality of services, and yes, to ensure that ScotRail is taking the action it needs to take to resolve the difficulties that have been experienced in recent weeks.
Jackson Carlo.
Well, that was so downbeat, I don't think it will be going faster than the slowest train. I mean, I'm afraid it's classic SNP. 1 minute they're talking tough, telling everyone they're going to sort things out. 2 years down the line, when things have actually got worse, it's all somebody else's fault. And while passengers are still waiting, trains are late, and millions of pounds are lost to the Scottish economy. Ministers do have a role to play, to hold management to account and to stand up for hard-pressed passengers. So as well as having, I hope, a very Merry Christmas, what will she and her ministers do to ensure that in 2019 we have a railway network in Scotland that is fit for purpose?
First Minister.
To do the hard work to make sure that these issues are resolved, to make sure that ScotRail continues to perform better than other train operators elsewhere in the UK. We'll continue to take forward the work to allow a public sector bid for the next rail franchise. And of course, we will do what I would expect the architects of privatisation on the Tory benches will oppose tooth and nail. We'll continue to argue for full devolution of all powers over the railways, so we're responsible for Network Rail as well as ScotRail, and so that this Parliament does have the opportunity to nationalise our railways and to undo the damage of privatisation caused by the Tories.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, can I associate my party with the remarks made by the First Minister about the Lockerbie tragedy? I recently visited the Drifesdale Cemetery in the Garden of Remembrance to pay my respects, and I found it to be a very, very moving experience. Presiding Officer, can I turn to a question which I think is very topical, because today our schools are getting ready to break up for the Christmas holidays. And can I remind the Chamber that back in October, the First Minister encouraged Scotland's teachers to write to her with any concerns that they had about Scotland's schools. So here is a comment addressed directly to the First Minister just last week from a school teacher in North Lanarkshire. She wrote, "Despite what you have said yourself on many occasions, it is becoming clear that education is not a priority for this government. First Minister, is this teacher wrong?"
First Minister.
Job to demonstrate to her that that is not the case. Education is a priority for this government. That is why we are continuing to ensure investment in our schools. For the last couple of years, as we've narrated in this chamber before, we've seen investment in our schools increase. We've also seen the action taken by this government through the Pupil Equity Fund to get more resources direct to head teachers. We've seen in the statistics published last week the rising number of teachers in our schools. We're also seeing evidence that the attainment gap in our schools is starting to close, as is the attainment gap in terms of access to universities. And of course, we see standards in our schools generally continue to improve. So we will continue to do the hard work to continue that progress and to persuade that teacher and all of the other teachers across the whole of the country that we value what they do and that we consider education to be the top priority that it rightly is.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, the letter I quoted is from a teacher called Esther. It was published in the Scottish Educational Journal. Esther is not only a lifelong SNP voter, she is also an SNP member and a local activist. But her concern about workload and the pressure on Scotland's teachers is now so grave that she writes of, and I quote, a crisis where schools are understaffed, and asks you directly, First Minister, how can we close the attainment gap when our schools do not have enough teachers? And she is not alone. Dean, another teacher and another SNP member, wrote in the same journal, I hear the rhetoric that Scottish education is at the forefront of the Scottish Government's priorities, but see little evidence of this. Presiding Officer, when we raise concerns about education on behalf of teachers and parents, the First Minister chooses not to listen. Will she at least listen now to the grave concerns being openly expressed by members of her own party?
First Minister. I have to say, I listen very carefully every time Richard Leonard rises to his feet in this chamber. Of course, we listen carefully to the views of teachers and parents and young people across the country. If we take teacher numbers in particular, we saw just last week a rise of almost 500 in the numbers of teachers in our schools. That follows a rise in the year before and the year before that as well. I think since I became First Minister, teacher numbers have increased by more than 1,000. The numbers of teachers working in our primary schools right now is at the highest level since I was at primary school in 1980. So the investment that we are ensuring in our schools is delivering those numbers of teachers. It's also delivering resources for head teachers to target the attainment gap and see that attainment gap start to narrow. So we will continue to support teachers as best we can. Of course, we have an ongoing negotiation around a revised pay offer to teachers that's, as I say, under negotiation just now. I would simply note in passing that Labour councillors at COSLA voted against last week making a revised pay offer to teachers. So we want to support teachers by resources in the classroom, by numbers of teachers in the classroom, and by making sure they're fairly and properly rewarded for the excellent job that they do as well. So we will continue as we go into the new year in getting on with that job.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, all I'm asking the First Minister to do is to listen to members of her own party. There are 3,000 fewer teachers in our classrooms than when the SNP came to power. No progress has been made in closing the attainment gap, and Scotland is facing its first teachers' strike since Margaret Thatcher was in Downing Street. The First Minister tells us, again, she said this morning that education is her top priority. But parents don't believe that. Teachers don't believe that. And now even her own party members don't believe that either. So, Presiding Officer, can the First Minister tell us why anybody in Scotland should believe that education is her top priority?
First Minister.
Teacher, as I've just said, teacher numbers are rising. Richard Leonard cannot deny that because the figures speak very clearly from themselves. As I said a moment ago, the numbers of teachers in our primary schools is at the highest level since 1980. I think the number of teachers overall is at the highest level since around 2010. So teacher numbers are rising. We are seeing the attainment gap starting to close. It is simply not true for Richard Leonard to say that that is not the case. And in terms of the comment Richard Leonard just made about the prospect of industrial action in our schools, I do not want to see that happen, and I will work as hard as I possibly can to avoid that. That's why, thanks to SNP councillors and others at COSLA on Friday, a revised offer on pay has been made to teachers. And I say again, and I ask Richard Leonard to reflect on this very carefully, Labour councillors at COSLA voted against a revised offer being made. If it had been down to Labour councillors at COSLA last week, there would be no revised offer to teachers on the table, and as a result of that, it would be the case that industrial action was closer. So perhaps Richard Leonard needs to reflect on the actions of his own party, just as I will continue to listen to members of mine and to teachers across the country.
We have some constituency questions, supplementaries. The first from Claire Baker.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, many people will have been shocked by the content of the BBC documentary on the death of Sheku Bayu in police custody. The programme highlighted concerns over the police's response, the Park investigation and how the family was treated. I appreciate this is currently a live case and the First Minister may feel restricted in her response. But does she recognise that the BBC programme shone a light on serious concerns over deaths in custody in Scotland that the Government have to deal with? Will the First Minister commit today to holding a comprehensive inquiry into deaths in custody in Scotland?
First Minister.
Can I thank Claire Baker for raising an extremely important issue? Can I also thank her for recognising that what I can say in response is restricted by the fact that this is an ongoing live case. Yes, though I do recognise the concerns that would have been and have been raised by the BBC documentary, although I cannot go into the detail of those concerns. However, in terms of the Sheku Bayu case, I want to say a couple of things. I've said these things, I think, before in the Chamber. Firstly, and I'm sure I speak for everybody in the Chamber when I say that my thoughts are very much with the family and friends of Mr Bayu as we approach Christmas at what will be an extremely difficult time for them. In terms of a public inquiry into that case and the more general issues raised by that case, as I've said before, that is absolutely not been ruled out by the Government. However, as Claire Baker is aware, the process to decide whether or not there will be a criminal prosecution in this case, which is a process governed by the Lord Advocate completely independently of ministers, is not yet concluded. When that process has concluded, obviously the Government will consider very carefully next steps at that point. And as I've said before, obviously one of the options open to the Government is a full public inquiry, and that is certainly not something that has been ruled out at all by the Government.
Tom Mason to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Tom Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure the First Minister will be aware of the reports this morning that the mechanical project services firm Richard Irvine, based in Aberdeen, has gone into administration with the expected loss of 110 jobs. This is clearly a distressing time for all involved. Therefore, can I ask what assistance the Scottish Government is able to provide so that staff are not struggling with Christmas just around the corner?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank the member for raising this issue? And yes, this will be an extremely difficult and stressful time for the employees of this company. In these circumstances, as the member will be aware, the Government's PACE initiative offers assistance to employees to look for alternative employment. But before that, or often simultaneously with that, the Government is always keen to talk to companies to see whether there is any action we can take to help avoid redundancy situations. So I will ask the Employment Economy Secretary to correspond with the member about the actions the Government is taking, and we will do everything we possibly can, not just in the run-up to Christmas, but after that, to provide all possible assistance to those affected.
Jackie Bailey to be followed by Jamie Green.
The First Minister will be aware of the decision by Vertex to resubmit Orkambi to the Scottish Medicines Consortium and to submit Simkevi for the first time, and their very welcome agreement with the Scottish Government about access to Orkambi now for individual patients as part of the PAX2 process. So I want to place on record my thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for Health and her officials, the cross-party group of MSPs, including Alex Neil and As Sawa and Miles Briggs, and of course the Daily Record for their tireless support. I know the Gallicas and all the families are delighted and regard this as a wonderful Christmas present. Will the First Minister ensure that PAX2 requests are considered quickly and that there is no delay within health boards for people with cystic fibrosis to access the drug?
First Minister.
Well, I'm very pleased indeed to confirm to Parliament that Vertex Pharmaceuticals has agreed to make submissions for their cystic fibrosis medicines to the Scottish Medicines Consortium. This follows constructive discussions between the Scottish Government and the company to ensure that our new medicines appraisal process is as flexible as possible while ensuring rigour in its assessment. The company has also confirmed that each of their applications will be submitted with a patient access scheme to improve the cost effectiveness of their proposals. Of course, the decisions as to whether these medicines will be made available are of course taken by the SMC independently of government. But I want to also recognise the very hard work of the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Scottish Government officials to get to this point, and of course all of those, including Jackie Bailey, who have campaigned to make progress on this as well. I think it is important to say that in the meantime, while these considerations are ongoing after the submissions are made, where these medicines are prescribed through the new peer-approved clinical system for individual patient access to medicines, Vertex has agreed to make these available to the NHS with a discount. So that is a process that is available to clinicians and to patients, and it's one that I would expect all health boards to operate as quickly as possible. But I hope this is good news that will be welcomed across the chamber, and particularly I know it is news that will be welcomed by the many families that are affected by cystic fibrosis.
And Jamie Green.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister will be aware of the news today that Ferguson Marine in Port Glasgow posted a loss of £60 million in 2016. The Yard blames, and I quote, interference and disruption from the Scottish Government for this loss. Does the First Minister recognise that assertion?
First Minister.
Far from interference and disruption, the Scottish Government has, as has been debated in this chamber, I think on many occasions, worked very hard to help and support Ferguson Marine to deliver the ferries that they are currently contracted to deliver, and also, of course, to diversify their business. It was, of course, action by this government when it was under previous ownership that stopped the shipyard from closing, and it will continue to be action by this government in support of those who own, operate and run the shipyard that I hope will see it continue to have a very bright future.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
The Prime Minister is indulging in a form of psychological no-deal warfare in a desperate gamble to revive her dead deal. The SNP have been on a journey and are now giving wholehearted support for a people's vote. Hallelujah! The Conservative councillors in Perth backed a people's vote this week. Amber Rudd indicated possible support yesterday, and Sarah Wollaston said she would quit the Conservatives if they backed a no-deal Brexit. Momentum is with us. What can the First Minister do to get the leadership of the Labour Party on board?
First Minister.
I'm sorry, Presiding Officer, the noise in the chamber, which I'm not sure whether that was people laughing with Willie Rennie or otherwise, obscured the end of his question, so my apologies. I didn't quite catch what you were asking me, but I think I got the gist of the question. I think momentum is building. I would agree with Willie Rennie. I'm not sure it's building for the Liberal Democrats, but I think it is building in support of a second EU referendum that gives people across the UK the opportunity to change their minds. Of course, people in Scotland don't need to change their minds because we voted to remain the first time round. That vote has been ignored, and I hope Willie Rennie will agree with me that if there is another referendum, the vote of the people of Scotland should be recognised and should be respected. I have to say right now the biggest barrier to making decisive progress in this direction is the Labour Party at Westminster. It is inexplicable to me why they have not thus far supported the SNP, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and Plaid Cymru in bringing a vote of no confidence in this incompetent, Tory government. If that motion passed, we get rid of that incompetent government, and if it doesn't pass, it forces Jeremy Corbyn to take a decision on a second EU referendum. So perhaps instead of constantly asking me about this, Willie Rennie outside the chamber can put a bit more pressure, as I am doing, on the Labour Party to try to get them off the fence into a supporting position, and then we perhaps in the new year can see the momentum towards a second referendum becoming unstoppable.
Willie Rennie.
With great foresight, the First Minister has anticipated my question. The Labour Party was once a beacon of hope in the world. Now the Labour Party isn't even a beacon of hope for the Labour Party. Chuka Amuna, Kezia Dugdale, Daniel Johnson, Ian Murray, they all back a people's vote. 86% of Labour members back a people's vote. I am sure the First Minister will be as frustrated as me with a Labour leadership that does everything it possibly can to avoid backing a people's vote. How many Labour supporters have to lose their jobs before the Labour leadership understands there is no such thing as a jobs-first Brexit? How chaotic does Brexit have to get before Jeremy Corbyn and Richard Leonard get off their backsides and stand up to stop it? So what words can the First Minister find to encourage Labour to live up to their responsibilities?
First Minister, you may ask briefly, but can I suggest to Willie Rennie that the First Minister is not responsible for answering questions on behalf of the Labour Party? Very briefly, First Minister.
I'm always happy to offer my services to the Labour Party if they're looking for some real leadership, which they certainly desperately need right now. I think I'm getting to like this new style Willie Rennie at FMQ, so we'll see if it continues into 2019. I'm slightly struggling, though, to remember the days of Labour as a beacon of hope. It certainly hasn't been within my lifetime, so I may have to pause on that. But there is a serious issue that I don't think we should fall, and this is advice to myself here as much as it is to anybody else. I don't think we should fall into the same trap the House of Commons did yesterday when faced with the biggest crisis the UK has faced for a long time to become some kind of pantomime exercise. There is a serious issue here. It is obvious to me that the Prime Minister's tactics are to run down the clock so that it gets to a point where it's either her deal or no deal. I think that is a dreadful approach to be taken when there are alternatives. But it also seems to me that that is Jeremy Corbyn's tactic as well, to try to run down the clock so that he doesn't have to take a decision on a second referendum. So I know he's not in this chamber, presiding officer, but I would appeal to Jeremy Corbyn over the Christmas break to reflect, yes, on the views of his own party and the reviews of many of his MPs, and above all else, the interests of people the length and breadth of the UK, and to come back in the new year supporting a second EU referendum so that people across the UK can get the opportunity at long last to reverse Brexit and find a way out of this sorry mess. I think that would be good news for the new year if Jeremy Corbyn found it within himself to show that kind of leadership.
Some further supplementaries. The first from Angela Constance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, there are currently 22 child refugees, boys between the age of 14 and 17, not that much older than my son, who have been accepted under the DUB scheme and are currently stuck at Cali waiting for a local authority placement. And the organisation Safe Passage is liaising with the Home Office, but there's a bottleneck in sourcing placements. And they've reached out to Scotland, they've reached out to Scottish local authorities who have been so generous in the past. And I know that the Scottish Government has been in contact with both COSLA and the Home Office, but that our care system is currently at capacity. So this is an impossible situation, a heartbreaking one, but not one that we can accept. And therefore, I simply ask the First Minister what more can be done by her government and actually all of us here today to really get behind, galvanise efforts to find a solution for all of our children this Christmas.
First Minister.
Can I thank Angela Constance for raising this hugely important issue. She's absolutely right to identify this as a heartbreaking situation, and it's one, of course, the Scottish Government is very aware of. We've been clear, and we will continue to be clear, about the need to welcome unaccompanied children into the UK and to support their recovery from the trauma that they have endured. The Scottish Government, as Angela Constance has already indicated, has been in touch with both COSLA and the Home Office, and we appreciate the urgency of this situation. While I gather that there are physically no placements to offer these children in Scotland at the present time, COSLA does continue to work with the Home Office and Scottish local authorities to identify appropriate placements for unaccompanied children when they are available. So I will give Angela Constance and the Chamber the assurance that the Scottish Government will continue to do all that we possibly can to work with COSLA, with the Home Office, and to offer the support, the practical support that these young people so desperately need. We will continue to monitor this situation over the holiday period, and we will offer any help and support that we possibly can.
James Kelly, to be followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Ferret Online blog reported at the weekend that government ministers had held 14 meetings with representatives of the airline industry who were lobbying for a cut in the proposed airport departure tax. Can the First Minister explain why, when trade unionists lobbied this Parliament last week, no government minister was available to meet the lobby, and yet government ministers are falling over themselves to meet members of the airport executives lobbying for a cut that would take money from the Scottish Government future budgets?
First Minister.
Firstly, of course, all of Ministers' engagements are published online, so there is no secrecy about that at all. Ministers meet with a whole range of interests. I meet with almost countless numbers of individuals and organisations over any given year. I would hazard a guess that if we weren't doing that, James Kelly would be one of the first to get to his feet and criticise us for not getting out there and meeting different interests. I meet with trade unions. All ministers meet with trade unions regularly. I do the biannual meeting with the STUC. We have a very good relationship with the STUC. We have a very good relationship with individual trade unions. At times, of course, that will be a relationship with tension in it, as it is with all governments, as there are issues that we are trying to resolve. But this government values and respects trade unions. We put fair work at the heart of our agenda, and we will continue to make sure that the views and the values of trade unions run strongly through everything this government does. And I hope we have the support, certainly from that side of the chamber. I'm not sure we'll have the support from the other side of the chamber as we do that. But we'll also meet with businesses, those who run our airports, interests in every corner of the country, because that's what an open, accessible, listening, engaging government does. And I'm proud that that is exactly what this government is.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A fortnight ago, I warned the Education Secretary that schools in the North East are at breaking point. And now, new Scottish Government statistics show that in the most deprived areas of Aberdeenshire, 4 out of every 5 S3 pupils are not reaching required levels of literacy. 14 years old, and they can't read and write to the expected level. Presiding Officer, the First Minister is not giving our kids a chance. After more than a decade of SNP government, will she apologise for failing so many Scottish children?
First Minister.
I think there's a huge amount of misrepresentation in the way that question was asked. Of course, the figures we saw last week show improvement in many of these areas of literacy and numeracy, and also is one of the sources of evidence that shows the beginning of a narrowing of the attainment gap, and that is because of the efforts that have been placed on that, some of the initiatives and progress that I spoke about in response to Richard Leonard earlier. So we will continue to do that job to make progress and to support all those who work in our education system. Again, you know, we hear in this chamber calls, to be fair to the member, he didn't call for more money for education, but I'm sure that's what he would do, and it's what his colleagues do all the time. But let's remember that the Tories are the party who prioritise tax cuts for the richest in society over investment in our public services. And while that continues to be the case, not very many people, if anybody, are going to take the Tories at all seriously.
Question number 4, Joan McAlpine.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the outcome of the recent European Council summit.
First Minister.
The entirely predictable reaction of the EU 27 countries to the Prime Minister's position at last week's summit demonstrates clearly that the UK Government must now stop wasting time. We are now just over 3 months away from the date the UK is currently due to leave the EU, and it seems clear that as things stand right now that the Prime Minister's deal will be rejected by the House of Commons and will not be renegotiated by the EU. The best outcome, in line with the views of the people of Scotland, is to retain EU membership, which is why we support another referendum, as I've just been talking about to Willie Rennie, and it would be outrageous if the Prime Minister's plan was instead to run down the clock to no deal. That simply must not be allowed to happen.
Joan McAlpine.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. Yesterday, the EU Commission released a number of papers on no deal and said that in the event of a no deal scenario, only basic connectivity would be maintained between Scotland's airports and the continent. Does the First Minister agree with me that we should, in such circumstances, we should revoke Article 50 to prevent a no deal?
First Minister.
Joe McAlpine is absolutely right. My position and view is very clear, and I made this view clear to the Prime Minister yesterday in London. The Government should, at this stage, request an extension of Article 50. Now, an extension would have to be agreed by the EU 27, but it should do that to allow time for a second EU referendum. And if the result of that referendum, as I hope it would be, is Remain not just in Scotland but across the UK, then Article 50 can be revoked. We know from the recent ECJ court judgment that it is possible for the UK to retain membership on current terms, contrary to the false choice that's been offered by the Prime Minister. She seems to me to have given up trying to make any positive case for her bad deal, and instead, extraordinarily for a government leader, is threatening to impose the disaster of a no-deal outcome on people she's supposed to serve. And following the EC judgment, that is not a tenable position, and it's certainly not a necessary position. So I would call on the UK Government to start acting in the interest of the people it serves, ask for that extension, allow people to look at this again, and if people change their minds, to revoke Article 50 and end this sorry mess once and for all.
Question 5, Graham Simpson.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister by how much Council's core budgets will change under the draft budget.
First Minister.
In the context of a Scottish Government budget that is being cut in real terms across this decade by the Conservative Government at Westminster, this Government continues to treat local government fairly, with a total funding package of £11.1 billion. The local government settlement for the coming year provides an increase in local government day-to-day spending for revenue services of £197.5 million, that's 2%, and provides an increase in investment for capital spending of £207.6 million, 23.7% increase. Of course, local authorities also have the ability to raise an additional £80 million to support essential services should they choose to use the power to increase council tax by 3%. Taken together, the total funding settlement delivers an increase in the overall resources to support local services of £495 million. That's a real terms increase of 2.7%.
Graham Simpson.
The First Minister has avoided answering the question as usual. She will have seen the figures that we all saw from Spice this week, which provide the actual answer she should have given, because once you strip away ring-fence money, then councils face a real terms cut of £319 million. That's £43 million in Glasgow, £22 million in Edinburgh, £19.8 million in North Lanarkshire, and £9.8 million in Dundee. No council escapes. So if the First Minister really believes councils are getting a fair funding settlement, perhaps she could name a single one that will not either have to increase council tax, cut services, or a combination of both. Name one.
First Minister.
Well, first of all, the totality of the money that local government has to spend is what matters. But let me quote the Spice report. Once revenue funding within other portfolios, but still from the Scottish Government to local authorities, is included, the total is a cash increase of 3.8% or 2% in real terms. That is the reality. But it's for councils to set their own budgets. But I make this same offer to the Conservatives as I made, of course, to Labour last week. If the Conservatives want more money to go to local government in the budget, we will listen, but they need to come to us and tell us where in the budget they want that money to come from. And they need to tell us how that is possible when they're proposing to take £500 million out of the budget for public services and give it to people in tax cuts for higher rate taxpayers. The Tories simply have no credibility on this issue. So we will wait with bated breath. The Tories are free to bring forward proposals, funded proposals. Let's see over the next few weeks whether the Tories step up to the plate and do that or not.
Question number 6, David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what assessment the Scottish Government has made of the capacity of NHS 24 to deal with demand over the Christmas period.
First Minister.
All health boards, including NHS 24, submit winter plans every year to the government. These plans are stringently reviewed to ensure that each board has the capacity and the contingency measures in place to deal with increased pressures which winter and the festive period bring. NHS 24 submitted their final winter plan on the 31st of October. This was assessed and signed off on the 16th of November.
David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last Christmas saw unprecedented burdens on our hard-pressed frontline NHS staff. But for many Scots who are elderly, have chronic health problems or a disability and have little family support, the festive season is a time for anxiety and concern, not celebration. Can the First Minister reassure Parliament today that vulnerable people shouldn't have to wait hours for a response for NHS 24? Can they rely on a festive gift of timely support? They deserve nothing less.
First Minister.
I agree with that. It's important to note that NHS 24 continues to provide a very highly effective and safe triage system. They answer almost 1.6 million calls in 2017-18, and the important point to stress is around 70% of these calls are handled by NHS 24 without any requirement for a call back to the patient. Where there is a callback required, clinical priority very much determines the time frame in which that callback takes place. We do recognise that the demands on all health boards, but particularly on a health board like NHS 24, increase over the winter and the festive period. That's why we are ensuring that there are higher numbers of staff working in NHS 24 over the peak festive period this year than last year. I can tell the Chamber that the number of call handlers and nurses that will be working on Boxing Day, for example, this year will be 458 compared to 397 last year and 373 the year before. So we will continue to work with NHS 24 to make sure that it provides the service that people demand and expect.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. One of the pressures on E&D departments at this time of year is a result of an increase in trips, slips and falls. Can I ask the First Minister how the Scottish Government promotes safety, particularly to older people, during snowy and icy conditions?
First Minister.
A very good question, and I can tell Claire Adamson in the Chamber that we always advise people, particularly the elderly, to take obviously extra care at this time of year. We encourage people to take sensible measures to prepare and to look out for their neighbours who might need an extra hand during periods of severe weather. The Ready Scotland website is a source of very useful advice on what to do to prepare for icy weather conditions, and we can all play our part in giving the right advice to people, but also looking out for people who might need extra help over the winter period.
And question number 7, Edward Mountain.
Officer, to ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government will acknowledge the people from across the country who will be working over the festive period to keep Scotland going.
First Minister.
I'm very happy not just to acknowledge but also take the opportunity to thank on behalf of the Scottish Government, and I'm sure the Scottish people, all those who will be working over the festive period, such as those in our emergency services, those who keep our transport moving, and people in the hospitality sector, to name just a few. We value very highly the contribution they make throughout the year. However, at this time of year, it is particularly important to recognise their efforts in keeping Scotland going. I'm sure the whole Chamber will wish to join with me to say a very big thank you to everyone working over the festive period, and although they may be working, nevertheless to wish them a very happy Christmas.
Edward Mountain.
I thank the First Minister for that answer, and I also would like to pay tribute to the emergency services and public services working over the Christmas period, including NHS, fire, police, and I would also like to particularly mention the voluntary groups that are working over the Christmas period, such as Mountain Rescue Service, the Coast Guard, RNI and Samaritans. And I would be grateful if the First Minister could acknowledge the extra work that they'll be putting in over the festive period as well.
First Minister.
I'm certainly very happy to do that. Volunteers, the length and breadth of our country, make a huge contribution all year round, but it's important, particularly at this time of year, to recognise what they do. And some of the organisations that Edward Mountain has mentioned, the Mountain Rescue, the Coast Guard, all do an absolutely exemplary job. So let me take the opportunity to thank everybody who will be working hard to keep the rest of us safe over this period. And since this may be my last answer, Presiding Officer, although that's entirely up to you, of course, I'll take the opportunity to wish you and everybody across the Chamber a very happy Christmas.
Thank you very much. On that cheery note, that concludes First Minister's questions. I wish you a Merry Christmas, and I close this meeting.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.